Hello, everybody. Welcome to GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. The great Tata Steel tournament has come to a close, but in its place steps up a big-time open tournament, the Gibraltar Masters, and I'll have the best action from the first 6 rounds. Now, if you missed Hikaru Nakamura in Vaikanze, don't worry for him. He's in a better place. Hikaru has the magic touch in Gibraltar, having won 4 titles, including the last 3 in a row. Counting the first 6 rounds, actually 7 rounds now because he drew today, where he leads now with 6 out of 7. He has an undefeated streak of 53 games on the rock, playoffs included. Now Nakamura is playing willing to challenge opponents in sharp theoretical duels. He won a nice one over Niels Grandelius in round 4. So we're going to start with that. And it's a Najdorf. Nice to see a non-Berlin. Bishop e3 and e6. This was big when Kasparov was the man, but after he retired, everyone started playing e5. But black players started doing this a little bit differently, and this idea of chasing the knight very quickly with b4 came into vogue. Black is hoping to get d5 in very quickly. So he guards against any knight c6 invasions. And this type of thing with the a3 and winning the b4 pawn, we used to see it slightly later on in similar variations. But here black sacrifices a pawn, but he gets in d5. Well, so white is going to have to play a little bit defense for a while. And here Hikaru plays bishop f2, which is really relatively untested. An interesting move here is e5, in which case white can sacrifice a piece like this and probably rook e1 check, which I think would provoke king d8. And then the next move is very hard to tell, even looking at the computer, but it seems that white has a promising position for the piece sacrificed, although it's very unclear. Grandelius played bishop d6, I guess, anticipating bishop g3 attack, although putting the bishop as a little bit of a target on the d file. Bishop g3, white is happy to trade off that guy. And now it's c4. White really just sees his way to an advantage now. The knight is not really in a position to move. Something like knight takes b4. White would have this shot knight takes e6. So black really has to go with bishop takes b4. But now queen g5, white wins his pawn on g7 with a nice tempo. Now black might have quite a reasonable position, except Nakamura finds a really nice consolidating maneuver. First, he retreats the knight, which just covers an awful lot of squares. And then he brings the queen all the way back, just covering everything. Now he's in a position to take the knight on d5, but also he's got ideas like bishop d3 just developing, and he's just playing a pawn up. So Grandelius finds a pretty good resource here, knight c5 takes, and then the big idea, bishop a3. And the thing is that if the king goes to b1 or c2, it walks into a fork either at c3 or e3, and black would be okay in both cases. So white only has one way to go, king d2, and then step up again, king d3, to avoid the knight checks. But this is sufficient for victory. Plays knight c3. If he takes on c5, white can take the knight on d5. All right, so knight takes a6, check, and king c2. So black can take the rook on d1, but the knight on b4 is attacked. He takes with the rook. If he takes with the knight, knight takes b4, knight e3, and this is almost working for black, but the king does have one square. King c3 would not do it because of knight d1, and he'd have to repeat. But there is king b2, and white is winning. So he took with the rook, but the problem is black has too many pieces hanging himself. And here, Nakamura, despite having quite a lot of time on the clock, he played very quickly in the next few moves, kind of old school Naka, certainly playing with a lot of confidence. He took the knight, which makes sense. The knight is much more in his business than the bishop on c6. King d7. White can probably consolidate a number of ways, but I like how Nakamura does it. He brings the knight back to e1 so that the bishop is now ready to move. And that's exactly what he does. Check. And he doubles on the 8th. But it doesn't really help much because the white minor pieces just harass the rooks and they run out of squares. He's desperately trying to hold on to that back rank, but after bishop b2, no more moves for the rook. And Grandelius had to resign. So that brought Nakamura to 4-0. He beat Duda in round 5, and then he had draws with Howell and Antipov after that. So he's doing well again in a place that's very comfortable for him. Now, Nakamura's 7th round opponent, Mikhail Antipov, he's doing well as himself. He had an interesting early duel with Elon Schwartz, who's a veteran of the New York City chess scene, who became an accomplished poker player, and I think he did so well. He got a lot of money for traveling, so he's playing in the Gibraltar tournament. So we'll take a look at that game next. That was a pretty short, sharp struggle, and Schwartz actually kind of missed an opportunity. So we'll do that one next. Okay, so Antipov playing white, and this is going to be another Sicilian. Okay, you don't get to see Kerry's attack very much anymore. Nobody allows it. And Antipov goes for the line with g5. And normally black plays knight c6. Schwartz plays a little different way, a6. And then f4 is a little unusual for white to play that this early. So already by now, we're in a new position, which is pretty shocking since it's, fits the basic contours of theory, but it's not actually. I think they transpose into a position where there's one game, rook e1. And now Schwartz boldly takes his pawn on h2, which is actually probably correct. I'm not sure if he knew what he's getting into, but Antipov drops in knight d5. Okay, it seems that black may be able to take this because after knight comes in, king c8, I don't see the follow-up for white. Komodo says black is much better. Maybe that's true, maybe not. It's hard for black to unravel, but it certainly seems that black could play that way. So I don't know what white's about to do. But the queen c4 that Schwartz played is fine. And Antipov answers with rook e3. All right, the computer says that white should be exchanging on f6, but that hand's clearly a good position for black. So rook e3, if queen takes a2, the rook can come to a3. All right, so now black has a couple of good continuations. The best move seems to be b4, just guarding the c3 square, preventing the rook from coming there, maybe threatening to take a2. And white maybe again has nothing better than trading some pieces, and black is doing well. Somewhat more complicated is knight d5, pawn takes, knight b6, and that's going to lead into some sacrifices. One line is b3, queen c5, de, bishop g2. The computer says that one is better than rook takes, queen d3. Hard to say. e7 and so on, and somehow it's vaguely even chances. Very complicated line. b4 it would be the simplest, but black made a big mistake with knight takes e4. Now this move is almost completely winning, except for knight takes e6, and now white is completely winning. Okay, the problem is there's going to be some mate threats set up. Knight c7 is a mate threat now. f5 is the most playable move, but it doesn't work all that well because white can just play rook takes e4, and has a much better position. But f5 was relatively best try, because after f takes e6 comes bishop takes e4, and now black resigned. Obviously, rook takes queen, bishop g6 is a mate. Black could try queen takes bishop instead, hoping for rook takes queen, rook takes d2, and then black actually is much better in this scenario, as he's going to get to take something. But queen takes e4 should be answered by queen takes h2, and after queen h5 check, Komodo sees mate in 15. It's always fun when they see that, but we could see after this continuation, knight takes e6, black position collapse. So as I said, after bishop takes e4, black resigns. So that's quick start for Antipov. All right, the Indian Grandmaster Sandeep Chandra started with 5 out of 6 with a curious victory over Vasily Ivanchuk powering the way for him. I know from experience how difficult it is to prepare for Sandeep. So I played him in the last round of the World Open one year. Half his games were under the surname Sandeep, and the other half were under the surname Chandra, which made it very difficult. But anyway, Ivanchuk reacted very poorly to a very surprising opening novelty. Let's have a look at that. It's a well-known position from the Nimzo Indian. Yeah, all this has been known for a long time, and in this position, knight takes a4. This has not been played before, and it actually doesn't look like it's so great. I mean, it looks like black has excellent chances for a blockade. Ivanchuk should have just simply castled here. I'm not really sure what the big idea is, because basically, the bishop can just retreat, and the black knight can come out to c6, maybe come around to e7 and f5, and white could maybe push the pawns forward, but the pawn comes to b4, the bishop can jump into c4. It's going to be difficult to queen those pawns. Maybe Sandeep looked at this position a very long time on a computer and decided that the computers are wrong at when they just look at it for a couple of minutes. But in any case, Ivanchuk really just falls apart here. First, he plays queen b5. I think it's not really so logical to be trading the queens. I think the rook and the pawns become stronger in the endgame. But I guess he just completely missed rook a7. So he does not stop to move the rook. Rook takes b7. And now the position is very dangerous for black, but there is one chance to save it. He can play rook f8. This is the only chance, but it looks like it might just hold. If b5, knight takes d4. Okay, now if c6, black can play knight takes b5. And he's even going to be better, because after rook takes b5, king e7. So you see, the rook f8 gets, he safeguards the back rank, and because he didn't castle, the king can come to the center, and white is going to lose a pawn here. So actually better than c6 is b6, but then I think that the black has to play king d8. I think that's the key move. I think a forced move. And then we see all kinds of drawish possibilities. So white has enough compensation, certainly, with those pawns, but doesn't seem to have a way to force them through. So that is what he had to do. Instead, he castled, and now his king is just too far away from the action. If knight takes d4, c6 would be a big story, because the king isn't a big difference, because the king isn't helping. Rook c7, and now Ivanchuk resigned, kind of sudden, but I think he was just really disgusted with how things had gone. He could play on a little longer. Knight takes b3, and now white should play b6. If c6, if black gets to take this pawn on c6, No, actually, that's not the one he wants to take. I think c6 black actually can play knight d2 check and knight c4 and blockade. That's what he has to do. So b6, knight a5, and now b7. This is what I want to say. Knight takes b7, rook takes b7. This position may be tenable for black, as the c pawn is not queening by force. But white doesn't have to play b7. He can play king e2 and bring the king to approach the knight, and that should be winning. So probably winning position for white, although Ivanchuk's resignation was a little bit emotional. But this knight takes a4, that was really a big chance, and it's unclear whether that was really the way to go. All right, next up, an intense theoretical battle between, which comes to a surprising conclusion in the game between Argentine Grandmaster Alan Pichot and Ivan Cheparinov, who is known to be a great theoretician. I think he was the second for Antipov for a long time. And this is, you guessed it, a Najdorf. This Najdorf producing a lot of fascinating games in this tournament. And this is going to be poison pawn. But it's the modern poison pawn with the h6 in. And so this is a position that's been explored a number of games. But h3 is, well, knight d7 is the main choice of grandmasters in this position. And that's, you know, where the major theory goes. But h3 has actually been playing a lot of correspondence games. All right. So after h3, bishop f3, knight d7, and now most of the games we see knight d5. Okay, a little trap. Queen takes queen, knight check, king d8, takes, king e8, bishop h5, yada yada yada. Right. So after knight d5, there's a whole bunch of correspondence games. You know, I think that they're all correspondence games. On the database, queen c5, right, and then rook fe1, or yeah, rook fe1, bishop d6, king h1. You know, I guess when everyone turns on the computer, they get the same ideas. Knight takes, pawn takes, bishop check, king d8, knight b6, and rook b8, rook ed1, rook h7. And the position starts to zero out. Actually, rook ed1, rook h7 came before bishop h5 check. My apologies. And they find a draw. For instance, bishop g6. Black can take, rook h8, bishop f7. Queen c6, this is one line. There's a few other ones. Takes. This is kind of a funny repetition. Rook h7, bishop g8. The rook has no moves, so they go back and forth and draw like that. All right, so who knows what Cheparinov had in mind if Pichot had gone down that road, but I don't know if he knew those games. He tries king h1, and now queen g5 was played in a game. After knight e5, it's a new position. And rook fe1, this appears to be not a great move. Computers don't like it, but I don't know how anybody plays this kind of position over the board. It's just too crazy. And here black can play queen g5, maybe is the simplest. But he goes for rook g8, and now white goes for a very hard to resist combination. Knight takes e6. He might very well have been expecting bishop takes e6, and then he's got rook takes bishop. I mean, he could even consider rook takes e6 check right away, but he's got threat of queen d7 mate, and also an idea of rook takes bishop and f7. But there was a very surprising type of refutation. F takes e6. Rook takes b7. All right. So now if he takes the rook, rook e6, king f7, queen d7, and the king has to go to g6. So now f7 check wins, king goes back, you take the rook, you make a queen, takes, check, king, queen f7. Mate threat on g8, and even bishop f3 check, queen f3 doesn't really help because white is still threatening to mate and also hitting the rook in the corner. But the problem was black is only losing that variation because the king has to go to g6, so a beautiful kind of clearance sacrifice, really, rook g1. And so if rook takes g1, then black can just take the rook on b7, and there's no rook e6. So he takes the queen, black throws in checks to centralize, and now he just takes. And now the king can just crawl into the corner, and white just played a few more moves, but he's got nothing. After queen g5 check, king takes f7. If queen d7, he can play bishop b7 or king back to g8. White's out of ammunition. So a nice win for Cheparinov. That rook g1 certainly makes a great impression. All right, finally, we've got spotlight on the Chinese Grandmaster Wang Hao. He's doing well in this tournament. Seemed like he took a bye in round 7 because I didn't see him playing anybody. I know that Gibraltar, pretty sure that they allow for half-point buys, which is, you usually only see that in America. But anyway, I guess he maybe earned a rest with a good start, and that first half of the tournament was fueled by an interesting mating attack that he pulled off with very limited forces. And this is against Zhu Yi. So 2 Chinese players come all the way to Gibraltar to do battle. And this is the Sicilian, but for a change of pace, it's not a Najdorf. It's a Rosslimo variation. And basically in the Rosslimo, whatever move black plays on the third turn, there's a fundamental choice to be made here that white can take the knight on c6 or not take the knight on c6. I know that in most of my games, I usually like to castle and maybe try to build a center with c3 and d4, and we certainly see that very commonly. Or white castles and he could play rook e1, knight c3. There's a whole lot of different ways things can go. But here, white doubles the pawns. And I think that this actually requires a lot of subtlety for black to play, because in general, he doesn't want to exchange the d pawn for the e pawn and have these doubled isolated pawns. He also usually doesn't want to put that pawn on d5. Then white might block it with c4, and the pawn on c5 can easily be attacked. So black often plays funny-looking maneuvers like knight e7 to g6, and the basic idea is to put the knight on g6 and, you know, bishop e7 castles, but at some point to push this pawn to e5, and then he can play d6, and his pawn structure, he's got double pawns, so his pawn structure is intact, and he can play for f5. That's sort of the ideal world. So here white pushes h4 to try to throw a monkey wrench into things. And there's various things that black can do, but Wang blocks that straight up with h5. And okay, Zhu plays e5 directly. Another idea might be to wait for the knight to go to g6 and then push e5, because now it comes to f5. But okay, and the knight f5 doesn't pressure e5. White's got that going for him. So knight d2, and black tries to get white to trade the e pawn for the f pawn so that he could have this very nice bubble of pawns in the center. But white says, not so easy. You take me, and my knight comes into e5, and then g6 is weak. So Wang decides that he's going to allow this exchange after all. But it's not the end of the world for black, even though those c pawns are very, very ugly, because he's kind of has a mini sort of a pseudo majority on the king side, and that pawn comes forward to e5. He's got more working pawns on the king side, and this light squared bishop is prepared to really come into play. White has given up his light squared bishop and doesn't have anything to play against it. So White decides to take the bishop on d6, get rid of the bishop pair, b3, queen d5. This is a really kind of subtle move, kind of preparing for bishop a3, and now White probably should have castled and could play bishop a3. Next move, perhaps, and those pawns are very weak, but also White has a little problem because his pawn on h4 is not so easy to defend, and if he's got to worry about that light square bishop getting loose. But I think he played an inadvisable move, bishop a3, which walks into c4. And that creates the threat of queen a5. So Black is able to undouble his pawns, and White gets some simplification. Maybe he was happy with that, because he is, facing somebody more than 200 points higher, and perhaps he thought he could get a draw out of it, but he was mistaken. Black creates some pressure, and there's that bishop. He's got some nice squares in the center to go to if he can get to them. And bishop b5. And although the computer doesn't really consider this a serious mistake, b4, I don't know about letting that bishop into the center. And now the position goes bad very quickly for White. With this innocent-looking move, knight f1, he wants to come to e3 and trade knights, but he doesn't get time as Black blasts open the king side. And normally with so few pieces on the board, you can kind of hope to sustain these blows, but Black is just going to take on g5 and play h4, or if White takes on f6, h4 comes, and when the h file is open, that rook on h8 can potentially penetrate to h1, and just too many pieces coming in to attack. He tried knight e3, takes, and perhaps bishop e4. I think bishop e4 is even stronger than rook g5, not allowing White to get e4. Because after rook takes g5, White should have taken the opportunity to play e4. He still has a very bad position, but maybe not lost. After bishop d6, rook g4, and now bishop e4. That pawn is rooted in place on e3, and h4 is coming. There's not all that much White can do. He tries to run, and this was also definitely no solution. He's hoping there's not going to be a mate in there, but there is. One last nice little trick, e5, and that's the end. The bishop has no safe squares to go to. So to avoid losing a piece, White has to take, and after takes, he has to take again. But now bishop f3 checkmates because the rook can now see its way over to the queen side, and then bishop e4 would be the finale. So a nice little checkmate with two rooks and a bishop. The old adage, bishop opposite colors favors the side with the initiative or favors the attacker, certainly proven there. All right, so that's those are for me the most interesting games so far in the tournament. Sorry if the Najdorf is not your thing, because we certainly had a lot of Najdorfs for that carries attack very very similar to Najdorf type position. But anyway, next week's show, I'll let you know how everything finishes up in Gibraltar. I've never been to that tournament. It seems like a great place to play. They have special prizes for women, which seems to make a little bit of a better social atmosphere there, I would imagine. So someday I hope to make it out there. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed my reporting of the action in Gibraltar. And please join me, Grandmaster Joel Benjamin, next time on GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC. Goodbye.